Welcome back.
I think I'm up to Carlton.
Welcome back to everybody. We're ready to go again. Senator Stirl.
Thank you very much, Senator McDonald. And Mr Hartfield, this won't take long, but I just want to ask, have you received any complaints, either written or verbal, about your Chief of People and Culture Officer, Ms Lucinda Gemmell, since September of last year?
Yes, I have, Senator.
Okay. How many?
Senator, 4 complaints, different complaints, and all.
Yes, either written or verbal.
Yep, 4 in total, and they have all been independently investigated.
Oh, okay. And are they all completed?
There is one that is still underway to be completed. The other 3 have been completed.
Okay. Can you tell us what the outcome has been of the investigation?
Not substantiated.
Not substantiated, okay.
Complaints.
So how many were investigated by the investigative branch that until recently reported to Ms Gemmell?
None, Senator.
Okay, thank you. Could you tell us how many investigations about Ms Gemmell that were sent to Safe Place were dismissed?
None of them were sent to Safe Place, Senator.
Oh, okay, thank you. So have all complaints and allegations been fully disclosed to the Airservices Board?
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. All right, that's fine. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Stirl. Senator Rice.
Thanks, Chair. I want to go to issues with Brisbane airspace design and the use of dependent separation approaches in Brisbane's airspace design. So has Airservices, what can Airservices say about whether the use of dependent separation approaches is compliant with ICAO standards?
I will ask Mr Curran to answer those questions, if he can.
Yeah, Senator, if I may, I'd like to take that on notice with regard to the ICAO compliance.
Okay. Have you done any review of whether it's compliant with the ICAO standards?
Senator, as a part of the process to implement the Brisbane New Parallel Runway, there was both a design and an implementation safety analysis undertaken to assess the safety of the design and can it be implemented safely, submitted to the Civil Aviation Safety Authority for endorsement. Whether that actually directly linked to ICAO, I would have to take on notice.
And who did that assessment?
Airservices Australia Technical
So an
Experts.
internal assessment?
Yes, that's correct, Senator.
Yes. So, so who, and in terms of that internal assessment, so that was using your in-house integrity and standards specialists?
Senator, it would have been a mixture of experts from Airservices, operational air traffic control personnel, as well as our in-house safety and risk assurance area. It's been put to me that the design principles for the independent parallel runway and the dependent runway approach are flawed and non-compliant with ICAO safety standards. Has that been raised with you previously? Senator, I'm not aware of such an issue being raised.
Okay. The issue that's also been put to me then is that as a result of the design, there's a concentration of noise over certain suburbs, because the independent approaches have been suspended in Brisbane. Perhaps you could talk us through as to what's changed then, for those of us that aren't experts in runway approaches, as to what the difference between an independent approaches compared with dependent approaches are.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I'll talk you through that and perhaps be able to provide some indication around the changes post-COVID. The operation of dependent approaches to an airport like Brisbane essentially means that there is a reliance on aircraft that are arriving to the other parallel runway. In a sense, it's as if both runways are treated as if there's a single runway there. So that's a mode of operation. Independent approaches are where runways are sufficiently spaced, which is the case in Brisbane. They are wide enough, there is enough distance between two of them that under the right circumstances we can operate as though they are just two completely independent runways.
So what's the current situation then?
The situation is that we would typically operate in that independent mode when there is a demand level such that we need to be able to operate the runways independently of each other. During the COVID period, traffic has been substantially reduced, as I'm sure you're aware, and as a consequence of that, we have operated the runways in a dependent mode.
Okay, so what has that meant for then operating them in dependent mode? What has that meant for then concentration of flights over particular suburbs?
So there's a number of modes that are permitted to be used at the airport, and I think it means that we're operating in a particular mode, but we've been operating in that mode not simply because of an Airservices choice. We've been operating in that mode because of a response to air traffic changes. As a result of COVID and border closures, there's been quite a healthy air transport market within Queensland, and so rather than there being the normal number of flights to southern ports like Sydney or Melbourne, there's been operations tending to the north inside Queensland airspace. And so the way that we serve those flights has been in accordance with the modes that are appropriate for that configuration of traffic.
I'm confused. So you were saying that you've been operating them in a dependent way because the traffic has been reduced due to COVID, but your answer just then actually implied that that hasn't been the case, that you've had more flights going north.
Senator, the mixture of operations has been significantly different to what we would have experienced without a COVID situation. There has been, at certain times, very few flights operating from the southern runway, which would head south, and there's been a greater use of the new runway, the northern runway, for flights heading north. And that's been a different mix of destination than would normally be the case for an airfield like Brisbane.
So if things go back, not that I'm saying that we don't know what the new normal is going to be, but as flights presumably increase over time, sort of going south again, you're saying that that if you then need to shift back into an independent approach, that you'll be able to do that. There's nothing stopping you doing that.
That's correct, Senator.
Okay. In response to, there was a question on notice that was put to you where you said that over the 14 months to the end of February 2021, Airservices Australia engaged 26 consultants for operational and administrative consultancies at a cost of $13.089 million. So you engage external consultants quite significantly, given that. Yes?
Yes, Senator?
Yes? Yep. So I wanted... Goodness. I want to then go to, in response to another question where you said that you did not engage, Airservices did not engage another air navigation service provider to review the closed STAR option at Brisbane Airport, and that no consultants were used by Airservices Australia in the flight path design work for the parallel runway airspace. Can you tell me why you didn't do those two design changes without independent review from external experts?
Senator, I have to take that one on notice. I think the plain answer is that we have the competency and capability in-house, and we're able to undertake the work ourselves.
But it has been common practice by Airservices to engage external consultants. So you basically felt that you didn't need to engage external consultants.
Not on this particular thing, because this is sort of one of our stock standard core competencies, Senator. The engagement of operational and administrative consultancies across the board, for example, was the Broderick Review, for example, which was, is one of the consultancies we use. So there are administrative consultancies, operational consultancies if we're bringing in testing for PFAS at locations, for example. They are the sort of things we use the consultancies for. A core competency such as airspace design and air route design, which we are doing constantly, we wouldn't necessarily bring in a consultant for.
Okay. And I mean, in answer to another question, you said that Airservices did not engage the UK NATS to review airspace design models at Brisbane. However, the Brisbane Airport Corporation did, and that Airservices Australia designs the flight paths, develops procedures and modes of operation. So you're confident that the private operator of the airport, with what they did in terms of conducting that review into Airservices Australia's airspace design for Brisbane?
Yes.
There's no conflict of interest there?
It's not uncommon for the airport to engage someone to look at how the airport should be run more efficiently. Perth, for example, when we had significant delays back in around 2007 with the mining boom going off, UK NATS were brought in to check runway occupancy times to improve the operation of the airport. So it's not uncommon.
And you were satisfied, I presume you were provided with the outcome of that UK NATS review?
I'll take that one on notice, Senator. I'm not sure. In the normal course of events, yes, there'd be a healthy exchange and potentially a robust engagement around the different views.
Okay, and can you also then take on notice what issues or concerns were raised in that review and how they were resolved?
Yes, Senator.
Okay, I just want to now go to the difference between proposed versus actual flight path design. That the 2006 Environmental Impact Statement originally promised Brisbane residents that flight paths would actually primarily be over water, that if flight paths over residential areas were necessary, then they would be minimised. Residential areas overflown by departing aircraft should not, to the extent practical, also be flown by arriving aircraft. But the community are telling me that you've failed on all four accounts, that nearly a third of flights continue to fly over Brisbane residential homes and families between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Flight paths have been concentrated not just inhabited, but in fact some of Australia's most densely populated residential areas, and that the same Brisbane residential areas overflown by departing aircraft on flight path I are also overflown by arriving aircraft on flight paths G, H1 and H2. How do you respond to those concerns from the community?
Senator, the communication and engagement with communities in South East Queensland around the use of the parallel runways system was that there would be a preferred mode to operate over water where practicable, I think, is the language used, or words to that effect. So
basically you're saying it's not practicable then?
Senator, the two main drivers for ability to operate the over-the-water mode, which is the preferred mode, absolutely, is traffic levels and also weather. They're the two primary drivers. Since the runway was opened, we've been operating over the bay for departures in excess of 50% of the time, and for arrivals in excess of 40% of the time.
Do you agree that that's very different to what the community was promised then in the EIS?
Senator, no, that's certainly not my interpretation, and that certainly wasn't what was communicated in the engagement activities which Airservices participated. The preferred mode was always made clear that it would be subject to weather and traffic load.
Okay, it's certainly not what the community understood as to what they were promised during the EIS process. You know, and you've got a community that's pretty grumpy. You accept that?
Senator, we certainly have seen an elevated number of complaints. As was touched on earlier, we provide a noise and complaints handling unit. We've seen some 1,000 591 complainants since the runway was opened, and that works through since the beginning of this year. That works through to about 6 to 8 individual complainants per day. Now, some of those complainants are making multiple complaints, but we're looking
Well,
at
they're having multiple impacts on their ability to have, peace at home.
Yes, Senator.
Impacts on their children, impacts on sleeping babies.
We have seen an elevated number of complainants since the runway opened, which in a sense is not surprising, but it is in the order of 6 to 8 complainants per day.
Following the release of the Australian Government's National Aviation Policy White Paper in 2009, there was the launch of the Significant Impact on the Local or Regional Community Guide, which now forms part of the Airports Act. You're familiar with that?
Senator, I'd take that one on notice.
It's a pretty critical thing, I would think, if you're concerned about air noise and impacts on local community, to be aware of it.
I'm aware of it, Senator, yes.
Right, thank you. Well, why did you need to take it on notice if you're aware of it?
I'm aware of it, Senator, yes.
Thank you. This document's sometimes also referred to as a trigger guide. It says that impacts may result from one element of a proposed development rather than development as a whole. Intermittent and cumulative effects need to be considered, and if the proposed development is to be undertaken in stages over a period of time, the impacts of the development, once completed, need to be considered, even if the potential impacts will not be evident in the first instance. Do you agree that the changes that the residents have experienced since the airport was opened are so significant as to constitute a trigger for the major development plan and the EIS to be revised and renewed as per those guidelines?
Senator, I'd want to familiarise myself with the guidelines specifically before I answered that question, so I would have to take that on notice.
Okay. Is Airservices doing any internal modelling or calculations to estimate the financial and economic losses being incurred by Brisbane residents as a result of the flight path design, decreased productivity, decline in property values, reduced livability?
Senator, Airservices isn't undertaking that kind of a study. The only study that I am aware of that relates to impacts from the infrastructure development that is the new parallel runway relate to the sorts of benefits that were foreseen in relation to job creation during the construction phase, or job creation and economic benefit resulting from its operationalisation.
How were the impacts that the community is now suffering, how were they covered off in the EIS? If you're saying that that's, as benefits, were those, considerable disbenefits, the costs that the community are bearing, how were they covered off?
Senator, I'm simply saying that's the study that I'm aware of in relation to the impacts. The EIS does have a number of sections that do deal with some of the impacts that you've pointed to, some of the disbenefits, and it does do some study or contain some information around loss of sleep for shift workers, these kinds of negative impacts in the EIS. It was a 2006-7 document, as you're aware.
Given the level of concern by residents, are you looking at all at potentially reviewing the impacts on residents and sort of doing, that sort of review, given that's very clear? I mean, I presume that when you're talking about the number of residents' complaints that you're receiving, that they have increased over the period of time since the airport, since the EIS was undertaken.
Senator, yes, there has been an increase in complainants. We're looking at about 250 on average per month complainants associated with Brisbane Airport since the new parallel runway opened. As I mentioned previously, that works out at about 6 to 8 complainants per day.
So look, my final question then. So what are you doing about those complaints?
So we have a post-implementation review, which is a part of our standard process. We undertake that typically around 12 months after a major change like this. The reason for that time frame is that allows a period with all the seasonality that we would normally get to look at the performance. The noise modelling and the forecasting that is done is all done around a 12-month frame, and so the 12-month period is important for us to allow that amount of time to lapse since the change was implemented.
And so when's that going to be undertaken?
We're intending that from July. I don't have a precise date, but it'll be in July. We'll commence that, and there'll be community engagement as a part of that. Importantly, one of the challenges we have with the Brisbane new parallel runway is the opening of it occurred during a COVID period of much reduced traffic. So it's proper that we take...
So once traffic boosts up, you can expect to have many more complaints, you would think.
Senator, that may be the case, but I think it's important in terms of a proper process that we will ensure that we look at the traffic levels during the COVID period, but also as traffic levels normalise. And so the reason I mention that is because we will need to conduct the PIR, the post-implementation review, in 2 phases, so that all those issues can be properly considered. But
you're starting that review in July with community engagement, but that review will continue on for some period of time because you need to get traffic levels back to some level of normality.
That is correct, Senator, yes.
Yeah. And what commitments, what changes could occur if the outcomes of that review show that the impact on residents is unacceptable?
Senator, I don't want to presuppose the outcome of it, but certainly there are the potential for some changes to flight path and operations. It is the case, however, that moving a flight path tends to go from one neighbourhood to another neighbourhood, so it becomes a trade-off and a matter for consultation and engagement with communities. So I should also, I guess, flag that those communities that are nearer to the airport, the options and solutions around what sort of abatement can be offered them is relatively limited, given that we need to have aircraft lined up some distance from the runway in a straight line, essentially. So those communities that are directly in the line of the airport, the options are relatively limited.
So they've just got to suck it up. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Rice. I believe that completes our questions for Airservices this afternoon.